Viewers, the budget will be presented on the 23rd by Finance Minister Mela. The NDA is under pressure after a less than satisfactory outcome from them, at least, after the Lok Sabha elections, to ensure that the people come away feeling as if this budgetary exercise will enhance their quality of living. When you look at the numbers, viewers, you see great optimism. India's economy has recovered smartly, remarkably smartly from COVID-19. At first glance, the macro numbers look good. Since FY 2022, GDP growth has averaged 7.2%. Consumer price inflation has oscillated between 5 and 6%, which is very manageable. The current account deficit comfortably averages between 1 to 2% of GDP. The government's fiscal deficit is in single digits in FY23, down from 13% in FY21. In fact, from 9% where it is at currently, it is expected to go down even further. Importantly, gross capital formation numbers and gross saving numbers both look set to support 7% plus GDP growth rate in the coming months. The IMF has in fact even seconded this by revising India's GDP growth numbers upwards this week. There's nothing not to like except when one looks a little closer. Growth, it turns out, isn't creating jobs, or to be fair, quality jobs, where the emphasis should be. 47 million jobs were added in FY24, but most of these were in unpaid or low-paid self-employed work and in agriculture. 45% of the labor force works in agriculture, which is not really anything to write home about, quite frankly. Globally, the trend is quite the opposite. Manufacturing accounts for only 13 to 15% of the GDP. Fresh investments by domestic private sectors fallen by 15%. 800 million people are living on subsidized food. Hardly any growth in export of labor-intensive manufactured products. Foreign investment in fixed capital formation is declining. And all of this taken together, friends, shows that there are some very, very significant problems which affect all of us that need to be addressed. The numbers, if you look at them when it comes to employment rate data or unemployment rate data, then under the NDA years at 2024, it's about 9.2% in June. And you go all the way back to 2013, UPA years, unemployment rate, according to CMIE, averaged around 5.4%, pretty much through the 10 years of UPA. The government's own assessment, however, isn't reflecting some of these red flags. From January 2021 to December 2023, the government says there was a trend of increasing labor force participation rate and worker population ratio coupled with decreasing unemployment rate across rural, urban and combined categories. These trends suggest a gradual improvement in labor market participation and employment conditions in India over the observed period. Now, all of this, of course, has been put out by the PLFS data, which is key employment, unemployment indicators for January 2023 to December 2023. Now, friends, let's hope that the need to put a brave face doesn't inhibit the finance minister from noticing the problem areas and addressing them. But can she? Can the budget prove to be a catalyst for real, wholesome job creation? Fundamentally, those are the questions we're going to ask tonight. There is no point trying to emphasize where the shortfall is, because I think that problem has been identified and only those who are severely blinkered will today deny that there is a real jobs problem. Real being the word that we must emphasize upon. Let's ask some questions. What can the FM do? Monica Hallan, author, Let's Talk Legacy, and is also a known economist, is with us. Gurcharan Das needs no introduction, is an author, is an economist, has worked in the private sector, is a columnist. I read a piece that you wrote a few days back. Santosh Mehrotra is also here with us. He's an economist who has a particularly withering view of the job situation. But everyone's opinion is welcome here. Where we need to focus, Mr. Gurcharan Das, is to try and assess whether the finance minister can actually create the jobs which are meaningful. What can she do?
Well, the finance minister cannot create jobs. The government really cannot create jobs. The government needs to create an enabling ecosystem that creates jobs. So the problem, let's take this problem out of politics. Actually, ever since 1991, it's been over 30 years. India has grown at almost 6% a year. It has lifted 400 million people, 450 million people out of poverty. The extreme poverty has come down to less than 5%. Middle class has grown from 10 to 30%. So there's a lot of, I mean, for a democracy to do this is quite remarkable. However, the fact is, the problem is that 6% growth has not created the kind of jobs that it should have. And the reason is that the economy has been firing only on 2 out of 3 engines. And you identified this earlier, that what has let us down, actually, services has done a stellar job, but what's let us down is manufacturing. And as you know, and the fact is, we have not still created an industrial revolution. And all countries that went from being poor to being middle class, whether in the West or the East, they all did it in the same way to create this industrial revolution. And China is the latest example through the export of labor-intensive manufacturers. So that's really the key. Now, the conditions today are actually far better than they were in 1990 to create that industrial revolution. Our infrastructure is far better. Road mileage has doubled since 2011. Port handling capacity has quadrupled. The GST has made us one country. Trucks are moving faster. The logistics are better. However, the reason I said this is not the finance minister's doing is she can do certain things, but the heavy lifting is to do the reforms that we need to do and which no government has succeeded in doing. Even the last government of Mr. Modi, the last 10 years, land acquisition is still a problem. More importantly, it's the labor codes. We think we have combined 50 bad labor laws into 4 labor codes, but they still have to be implemented. And certainly, our electricity rates are uncompetitive, our freight rates are uncompetitive. So, I mean, I could go on, but you can see where I'm going.
Yes.
That this will require heavy lifting. Now, the Prime Minister Modi is really one of the things, you may agree or disagree with him on other things, but he's an implementer. And and this really requires, it requires also education, an apprenticeship program, reform in education. So there are now multiple ministries involved. So this project of doing this has to be interministerial. It should be coordinated. And
Okay.
India does well in a mission mode. So that is really the approach we need to take. There are other things I can talk about, judicial laws.
Let's get everyone's initial opening remarks in, and then we can sort of focus on the particularities also. We'll come back. Let me move on to Monica Hallan. Dr. Mehrotra is also there with us. Monica Hallan, if you can hear me, what do you think is the road ahead now? is the budget going to provide that very important catalyzing effect which will help in perhaps propelling job creation, meaningful job creation?
Rahul, it's not up to the government to provide jobs. This whole idea that it is the job of the government to provide jobs is deeply flawed. Because the way that I see it, this is that classic fight between socialism and capitalism. And that socialist road leads to where Argentina was. And a mix of capitalism along with welfare leads to sustainable growth. So this idea that it is a government job that needs to be created is just deeply flawed. And then rising from that is the story that what we need are private sector jobs. The budgets, the past few budgets, the past few government years of government policy have done what they could to trigger private investment, because once you have private investment, that will create jobs. So the government did the heavy lifting with capital expenditure in the last few years. And for FY25, I think they budgeted 31% of total expenditure as capex, right? So the idea, and they've done PLI, corporate tax rates are low. They are lower than what individuals pay at the marginal rate. You've cleaned up the banks. The twin balance sheet problems are history. You've cleaned up the house. You're waiting for the children to play. But private sector investment, we are still not seeing that green shoot story is still on. We are not seeing saplings yet. One of the two reasons for that, what I understand, is that there is still excess capacity in the system. China then exports its excess capacity to us, and consumption is down. Okay, the growth that consumption should have been at is not there. Post-pandemic, it has not reached the levels. These are structural problems. I don't think a budget can address private sector job creation more than anything. The only thing it could possibly do is try and trigger consumption. See, what we need today is people to consume more, to spend more, so that then the investment cycle can begin. And how do you do that? If you talk of tax cuts, there is a small sliver of Indian population, poor things, all of us who pay taxes. You give us a little bit, how much more will we consume? Will we pay off our debt? I have actually heard some very interesting ideas in the past few days, one of which was that ATC benefit, which is 1.5 lakh, make it up to 5 lakh and allow people to set it off against consumption of TV, fridge, of whatever consumer goods, of cars. Allow people to get that tax benefit for consumption and not investment, because what you need is consumption today. I think there is limited capacity. And then the third point in this is the problems that we have are beyond the scope of the budget. Two parts to it. One is a lot of the issues remain with the state because implementation of projects happens in the states. And the other problem really is this idea that government spending will trigger more jobs. So really, these two issues have to be sorted out. There is a structural problem of not allowing major reforms, labor reforms, as well as agriculture reforms. These are the two big reforms that we need. And the third leg of this thing is, of course, the bureaucracy and the judiciary, who remain, I think, a big stumbling block to growth. The fourth problem remains corruption. I personally think it adds about 10% to project cost. It has not gone down. We had hoped that it would, but it still remains about 10% of project cost. And maybe Gurcharan can tell us, because he's more integrated with the corporate sector. I still think that's a cancer which really pulls us down from this road.
Well, the couple of issues that you've raised, Monica Hallan, I want to bring in Dr. Mehrotra, are really hot button issues even for the opposition. Labor reform, any talk of that, and I think that's what stilled Modi's hands in the first iteration of his government itself. He went in with a few ideas, but completely fell away from them. Agriculture reform, these three big bills, and we know how that ended. And corruption, of course, the moment anyone tries to affect a cleanup, it becomes very quickly politicized. So let me bring in Dr. Mehrotra. Dr. Mehrotra, look, yes, the government has done heavy lifting. Both our speakers seem to suggest that the PLI scheme, the capex spending has certainly gone up, corporate tax is down, the twin balance sheet problem has been solved by and large. There have been other steps also that have been taken. Yet a large number of people constantly question the government's inability to get really the job situation going. Perhaps we have to ask some of our heavy private, I don't know, private investors to get into the game. We also haven't seen much private investment coming in.
So Rahul, let me just begin by saying where all three of us are in complete agreement, so let's not argue about that. And then I will turn to some of your questions, if I may.
Of course.
I agree, first of all, with Monica that there are structural problems, and I will refer to them. Secondly, I agree that the budget alone cannot alone create jobs. It plays a small role. And third, I agree that consumption is still consistently low, and a very good reason why consumption is consistently low, and that's demonstrated by the following statistic, that the claim is that the economy is growing at 8%, but we know perfectly well that private consumption expenditure has only been growing for the last few years at 4%, which is half that rate. Given all these things that we are all agreed on, where are the issues where I might disagree? May I begin? Firstly, a claim is repeatedly made that public investment has risen, and in fact, I'm told that it's going to rise from public investment in infrastructure of 10 lakh crores in last budget to 13 lakh crores in this budget. However, what is not recognized about this public investment is the following, that unlike the period during the 11th and the 12th five-year plans, the private sector has not been crowded in. I think Monica referred to this. In some ways, Mr. Das also referred to this. So what is happening? That the private sector is not crowding in with its new investments. Secondly, the central government's increase in investment in infrastructure has come at the expense of what otherwise would have been undertaken by CPSU, Central Public Sector Undertakings, because they are now devoid of any surplus, and those surpluses have been made to flow to the central exchequer. And that is enabling the central government to increase capital expenditure. So there has been an offsetting of the capex in the public sector as a whole, because it was not just the government that did it. Earlier, it was government, central government, plus CPSUs. And the fact is that overall, as a proportion of GDP, public investment has not risen. And one of the reasons why private investment is not kicking in, because private investors know perfectly well, it's not just got to do with capacity utilization, it's got to do with consumption demand, consumption not growing. And jobs have not been growing, regardless of what narrative anyone, RBI, SBI, government might put out. The fact of the matter is that has been proven beyond a shadow of doubt by the annual survey of unorganized enterprises, survey put out for 21-22 just in the last 15 days. And we know perfectly well that whatever private investment is being undertaken by the corporates, may I finish, ma'am? I didn't utter a word, nor did I raise any fingers. That private investment by the MSMEs has not risen because they are still suffering from the policy-induced shocks to them of one, the demonetization, next to a badly designed and implemented GST, and third, to a poorly designed a national lockdown of the strictest kind implemented by the national government at 4 hours notice. So for all these reasons, unemployment is still high, and that structural problem is not easily going to be addressed by the budget. I'm expecting good news. I'm expecting that in this budget, they will announce a PLI for the labor-intensive sectors. The problem with PLI has been that 14 sectors were announced and massive subsidies have been paid, when in fact, large part of those subsidies should have been used for investing in our universities and schools. And what is in fact should have happened is that only 2 of the 14, and I'm finishing, 2 of the 14 PLI sectors are labor intensive. So the government is going to correct its mistake this time, and that might be a saving grace for the current budget.
Okay, so let's now that all three agree that there is a problem with consumption demand or consumption expenditure, let's basically talk a little bit about how we can somehow overcome this lag. And some people, Monica Hallan and Gurcharan Das, Monica Hallan, perhaps first you, many people have said to get consumption going, you need to hand out some incentives. Now, can that happen in this budget or going forward? Is that what's needed?
Right. Right. So just before I come to this question of consumption, just on the employment issue, jobs issue, I think I need to frame it a little differently. I think we have a wage problem and not a job problem, because people are unwilling to work at the possible wages that they're getting. So there is a wage problem. There is a skill mismatch. So at the two ends of completely unskilled and super skilled, you have jobs. But it is the missing middle where you are not finding adequate skills. And I'm going to put a third one here. There is also the problem of the intention to work. Because, again, because of this politics, you are getting free handouts.
That's right.
Food program, there are different states giving you doles. And then you add into the mix the very poor urban infrastructure. Why would somebody migrate to a hovel when sitting in the village, she or he is getting food, you have your land, you have some other doles? So it's a far more complicated problem than saying there are no jobs. I think the jobs are there. You can talk to anybody from a street side vendor to a contractor to a large company like L&T, who all say we don't get people. Okay, there is a common refrain to say we don't get people to work. There is a skill problem, there is a wage problem, and now there's an intention to work problem that unless things improve in the cities, unless you pay them enough, they are not going to come. And that's a very rational decision to take. Now, just to address your point on consumption, I did say that, look, giving a tax break is going to be emotionally, it'll put people emotionally in a better place. It's not going to trigger consumption, because look at how few people pay taxes in India. And that's the other story. Why don't we tax everyone better? I think some tax breaks on consumer spending. Expand whichever ATC, get another section into the already fat tax book. Please give a break so that when people go out and spend, there is something that they get back in return.
Okay. Gurcharan Das, consumption.
Yes, well, I think let me take off from where Santosh left off. You know, the reality is that all the countries in the East that have succeeded in the last 50 years, they've all done it through the export of labor-intensive manufacturers.
That is true.
Now, the PLI scheme, and Santosh hinted at this, really, the PLI schemes should reward exports and should reward labor intensity. So choose the sectors which are labor intensive. Now, either large Indian companies could do it, but frankly, I think in large Indian companies, you'll have to go and disrupt those consumer markets in the world. And I just don't think they have the appetite or the R&D background to provide superior products to consumers.
Friends, let's see if the finance minister is aware really of this consumption gap. We leave it at this. Exciting days coming up, viewers, with the budget. Stay tuned because CNN News 18 will be covering the budget wall to wall.